Hi, I'm Mike Maloney, and welcome to another CSRM podcast. Today's episode is hosted by Dr. Greg Linville.
Okay, we're back again on the CSRM podcast with who's become now a good friend of this, and Vernon Wendt is a pastor within the Missouri Synod Lutheran, planting a church as well as revitalizing a church. And if you want to catch up a little bit about his background, go back 2 podcasts ago, a couple weeks ago, and learn about his own personal journey, but then also some of his theological ponderings and writings that we featured. There's some PDFs and books and even audio versions of some of the things that he's been thinking about in terms of the integration of faith and sport. And last session, Pastor, we talked about was competition itself biblically defensible. We answered that, yes, Christ competed, Paul competed, so it would seem that if Christ was sinless, then competition is not a sin. And then we started down this road that we think that probably most sports, we didn't absolutely make a decision about this, but it would seem that most sports would be biblically defensible if the rules and the intent of them matched up to our theological grid work about what makes them biblically defensible.
So I would have to add to that. Sorry for interrupting you.
Go ahead.
Add that it's up sometimes the individual too. Just like you have a weaker conscience. Some people can play like Gus Macker tournament, 3-on-3 tournaments. They're very cutthroat when we played, and some people just couldn't play the Macker at all.
So let's go with that right there. Take that and run with that a little bit.
Sure.
The sports biblically defensible, but for an individual, you're saying it may not be.
Exactly. So just like the Bible, some people could eat the meat sacrificed to idols, some could not. And so that's, again, if you have a weaker conscience, or that this really, if you have an anger thing that gets you really heated up and it's not righteous anger, maybe that sport's not for you. Where others can come into that sport and play all day and get trash talk and all that stuff, and it's not a problem for them. So I think that's something that we can't judge somebody's individual relationship with Christ. So we can lay it out as Dr. Levine has done. We can lay it out so you can be a Christian in this sport, but others can come to this sport and it affects their faith badly, wrongly, and then, well, maybe you can't do that.
This is an excellent thought. And I have a very good friend by the name of Mickey, and Mickey describes his journey that he was like that, whether it was on a softball field or a basketball court, and he knew one Bible verse his entire, first 30 years of life or something, and that was the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept, and he said, so I'm going to knock your nose on the other side of your face so that you can be like Jesus and you can weep. But he was saying that facetiously, obviously, but that he had that kind of struggle, and it may be biblically defensible, but if you have a character issue or weakness, personality issue, that maybe you cannot. And for some people, it may be anger, it may be they can't control their language, but it may be that it's like a drug that they have to win and they have to be honored, and it may be that it's so all encompassing that they get all out of fellowship. They don't do anything with the church, even with their wife or husband. Or what am I saying that resonates with what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. I think we agreed this in our conversation on the phone the other day. Our ultimate goal is discipleship. So sports is a part of your life, but it's not the entire thing of your life, because it's a long journey. I'm older, so I'm not, I'm not a prime athlete anymore, but I know that I am ministering to some people in the prime athletes. I got one of the top freshmen in the country right now. That's where my preschool director's nephew at Lexington Catholic here, and he's recruited all over the country. And that's his life right now. And he's not a member of my church, but he's part of that ministry in a sense, and still talking to him and sharing Christ with him. So we need to balance that, and everybody's got their stage, but the long term, as we shared earlier, is discipleship and bringing them to relationship with Jesus Christ that goes beyond that, just the athletic field, going off the floor too.
And so we have to be careful with these analogies, but let's talk about it in this way. That at the very least, if someone is involved in athletics in a sport, and they are finding themselves in this way, that they are constantly compromised, their walk with Jesus, their discipleship is constantly under duress, if not absolute failure, that it may be that they cannot compete in that particular sport, or maybe any sport. And at the very least, we would say in the analogy that if my addiction to alcohol is such that I literally cannot go anywhere where it's served. And I'm actually recording this at a Chautauqua where I'm at for the week, and the Chautauqua is completely alcoholic free. And I've had a number of friends, in fact, one who's coming this week, who started their journey to sobriety at the Chautauqua because they weren't ever tempted by any of that. So that's similar to this with a sport. But there's also then, how do we compete in the sport beyond that? And I ended last podcast with you with the question, because you're a basketball fanatic, and I say that in a positive because I am too. It's all good. And I ask you, would Jesus ever foul in the sport of basketball? And to give you a little more to run with here, since our salvation is dependent upon Christ's righteousness, meaning he never sinned. So now you need to be careful about this fouling situation. Could Jesus have fouled? So go ahead, I'll let you answer that.
Is it a sin to foul? That's the deep the question. Because we're all, in a sense, unless you're Bill Lambier, you never fouled anybody. The Pistons. I'm a Bad Boys fan, but who, me? I would say if Jesus competed in the playing floor, he'd probably be called for a foul. And then you're talking about intentional fouls too, possibly, to stop the clock. Is that part of the game, more so than being an absolute sin against the Ten Commandments? I would say that's part of the game. Again, not to disparage part of the game, injuring somebody. That's something completely different. We're not going out to deliberately foul somebody to injure them. Maybe the Bad Boys got a little bit more of that in the Pistons days, but that's not what we're out to as Christians. But there may be a time where we either unintentionally or intentionally foul somebody in a basketball court, and I don't think that would be a sin. It's part of the game.
Yeah,
and I saw it wrong way anyway. So
So some of it is how we define fouling, and I think what you're saying is that there may have been a time that even an intentional foul is within the spirit of the game. You've got to stop the clock, and all of that would be biblically defensible, and therefore Jesus would not sin. But the follow-up question is, who would call a foul on Jesus? Is there a referee alive that would call the foul on Jesus?
Yeah, the Pharisees. Yeah, well, if Jesus is calling a foul against my team, I'm gonna playing a team. Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, I think in some ways, obviously, it's kind of a humorous way. I hope it's humorous to people to try to figure out our way around this.
Yeah, I think I don't know if Chad Carlson and Brian Bolt. They they did a podcast on that also, I believe. And they're was it deep faith? I forgot, Deeper Life. They're Calvin and Hope profs. They got a podcast too. I would have to find that for you.
Yeah, and let's take it now a little deeper in how would Jesus play the game of basketball today? What would be his Christmanship ethic that we should try to emulate?
Well, I think that not only the joy, I think it would bring a lot of joy to the sport because play is a gift of God. And if you have grace, you can play. And I think that's the gift he would bring. The camaraderie, the teammanship, the striving for excellence, whatever skill set may be as a 5'10" Jewish kid. I don't know what tall he might have been on the playing floor. I think there would be striving for excellence, whatever is gifted, whatever his athletic ability would be. There would be respect for obviously the coaches and the refs, and a love that God has given this gift to play.
And we would call this even worship. Yeah. And in the same way that somebody can worship God by playing a guitar or an organ or singing, or someone could worship God by performing a dramatic art. That
I love that, yeah. Because I when I interviewed the athletes for my dissertation, you'll see this maybe if you ream through the whole dissertation. I forgot how long it is, but some of the athletes at like a Wheaton or a Bethel, or that really emphasize Christian music and church. I said, well, I don't have a gift for music. And, they kind of feel guilty. I just have this gift of sports, and sometimes they're looked down upon in certain contexts in Christian circles, but that's what they bring. And what we're trying to pass on is also you bring this to your children, or as a future coach or parent, and you're bringing this whole atmosphere with you.
In the Christmanship book, we call it a progressive intensity level, a PIL. And to help you understand that, at the first step, if you will, would just be play. Think about two kids on the beach playing in the sand. There's no rules, there's no nothing, they're just playing. But then they get into what we call playful games. I can build a sandcastle better than you can. And now there's a little bit of a definition, but it's still playful, it's still a game. And we've actually identified 7 steps in the PILs that will probably come up on the screen here again. Mm-hmm. And it moves up through then sport, and it goes all the way up through what we would call professional sport. And what we have identified is that it's pretty easy at the play stage to play like Christ. But when you're getting paid at a certain level, and think paid not just the LeBron James of the world, but the coach of the middle school team and your local middle school, they're all professional because they're getting paid to do something within sport. Mm-hmm. That as those PILs go up, the higher you go up on that, the harder that it is to maintain your Christmanship. And what we've identified, actually, and I think that your research that you had mentioned, that I think people would do well to read the dissertation and figure out what some of these college athletes, coaches are struggling with and what they go through. We've got 4 quadrants. And so the north-south axis is the PIL, and the east to west is what is the expectations of other people, etc. And so we can place ourselves in any of these quadrants. And what we find is that the most difficult ones for them to be in, Christians that are trying to be disciples of Jesus, are above that kind of 3rd, 4th level. And now we get into zones that are very, very difficult to find the joy that you mentioned. That's what made me think of this, as you talk about it. And of course, the great movie about Eric Liddell and When I run, I feel his pleasure.
Pleasure, yeah.
I run and I feel his pleasure. As he said that, and as I've interviewed family members and people were in a prison camp with Eric Liddell, and I talked, and as far as I can tell, he never actually said those words as he did
Yeah.
there up on
Yeah.
Aldreich in Edinburgh with his
Yeah.
sister in a movie. And yet everybody that I talked with said that was his attitude.
Yeah.
And so the movie producer, I think, got it right. But we struggle with this. Your thoughts about struggling with those PILs and
Right. Well, I mean, the passage, the Zechariah passage, where the God's kingdom is compared to little kids playing in the streets, which Tennyson and Rick Tallenter, got his book title "Heaven is a Playground," and I think that's expresses that joy again. But you're right. When I was in Chicago, I lived in Elmwood Park, right by Concord River Forest. I was adjunct over there, and all these playing fields by, and you see these little kids running around. They have no idea what they're doing on the soccer field, but there's so much joy chasing after a soccer ball. But the older they get, even though they're not professional levels, you can see a seriousness that was kind of like, they're missing the joy sometimes. And I remember one of my friends growing up, my basketball buddies, his uncle played for IU 76 championship team, Bobby Wilkerson. And once I remember, just curious for little kids, what is it like playing for Bobby Knight? Bobby Knight made me hate basketball. And that's, kind of that thing, so high pressure to play for undefeated championship team. He played professional, but now I guess Bobby ended up coaching basketball later on. He's retired now, I believe. But that I remember that glimpse of that basketball became something you hate. Or I'm sure growing up, he loved it.
That's so helpful, because if we can't find the joy in it, then there's really something wrong. That's not the way that God would have envisioned this.
Right.
And any of my former students or colleagues would know that I have to at least get this in once. And that is that why is basketball the greatest game ever? It's because it was created by a Presbyterian minister
There we go.
that teach the gospel. And we've covered that before. We won't go into that again, but it is with that intent that we are to glorify Jesus, and that we can have the joy in doing that. And that's what I sense in your heart, your spirit, and your.
It is the greatest. I mean, God somehow 1892, God said, "Hey, this world needs basketball." So,
That's right.
And you talk about Don Old and the mission trip we talked about earlier. How could he give to communist China?
That's right.
Basketball.
Yeah, and he did Venture for Victory, as you mentioned in the first podcast in this series, and that was some of the very first short-term sports missionary, and that was 80 some years ago now. And some of us that are thinking, well, this is brand new. Well, we've got decades, almost a century into this that we're doing it. And I also will tell you is that I hold in my possession a copy of the letter that Jane Naismith, granddaughter, wrote, because she supported somebody financially to go on a short-term mission trip. And she mentions that he would have been so pleased to know that the game was being used in this way. Well, that's another story down the street, but you've been very kind and gracious with your time to be
thank you.
This.
My honor.
And again, I'm sure that someplace along this podcast that to get a hold of Pastor Wendt, that information, that contact, he's offering for you to get these PDFs of some of the stuff that he's written and some of the sound bites that he's done in an audio form. And we really resonate with you, and our hearts are united on this. And we're hoping that people will dig deeper. We're hoping that this series will help people to want to dig deeper into how to integrate faith and sport, and then teach this to the folks that are involved in the sports in their local church, sports, rec, and fitness. So last words or last encouragements, Pastor?
Well, I appreciate that. It's Levine, right? The last name is Levine. Did I pronounce that right, Dr.?
Linville.
Linville. I'm sorry, Linville. I should get it better. But Dr. Linville, you may know this. I used in my sermon a couple of Sundays ago that the best thing that happened to him is his son married a good old Missouri Synod Lutheran girl. So there you go. So, no, I just happy to meet him and an honor to be a part of this podcast. And thanks, Steve Balder, for introducing me.
Well, all right. We've come to the end of our time, and thanks for joining us on this edition of the CSRM podcast. And know that you can go online and get all of the ones that have been archived through the years, and all of the books and all the other articles. And there will be also connections that you can get a hold of Pastor Wendt. And those of you that are in Northern Kentucky, where Pastor Wendt is, we are establishing a regional group down there. And we're hoping that there will be a number of you that will come and get involved in that. The regional groups meet anywhere from quarterly to monthly, and they try to figure out how to better reach people who are far from Jesus and his church using sports, rec, and fitness. So we welcome anybody to this process. Goodbye for now. Thank you, Pastor Wendt.
Yes, thank you. All right.
The CSRM podcast is a production of CSRM and their production house, Overwhelming Victory. Dr. Greg Linville is the executive producer, and Scott Stedman is the associate producer and editor. To learn more about CSRM, visit csrm.org. For more information about Overwhelming Victory, visit overwhelmingvictory.org. The CSRM podcast is the flagship member of the podcast network Overwhelming Victory Radio. For more information on Overwhelming Victory Radio, or to listen to our partner podcasts, visit overwhelmingvictory.org/OV Radio. For CSRM podcasts, I'm Mike Maloney. Have a blessed day.